The Indo-Aryan languages are one of the largest language groups in the world, with between 800 million and 1 billion native speakers. Today, they are almost entirely concentrated in South Asia, where they comprise the dominant languages of every South Asian country other than Bhutan. Because of this modern concentration, we might expect our earliest attestation of the Indo-Aryan languages to be in South Asia. But weirdly enough, we find some of our earliest datable evidence not in South Asia, but instead in West Asia. Today, we are looking at one of the stranger discoveries from the Near Eastern Bronze Age, the Indo-Aryan influence on Mitanni. Now, before we get started, I should say my accent is not designed for pronouncing Hurrian, Indo-Aryan, or Iranian terms. There will be some mispronunciations in this video. I'm sorry about that. I'm going to do my best, but unfortunately, it is going to sound a little bit like someone from Edinburgh saying these things, not quite a native speaker. First, I should introduce the subjects that we are going to be talking about today. The Indo-Aryan languages are a branch of the Indo-European languages today spoken across South Asia. These include languages like Punjabi, Bengali, and the Hindi-Urdu dialect spectrum. These languages were brought into the Indian subcontinent during a period known as the Indo-European migrations. This refers to a period between the 4th and the 2nd millennium BC, where these languages spread probably from the Pontic-Caspian steppe across Eurasia. By the end of the 1st millennium BC, being spoken from Western Europe all the way to the Bay of Bengal. These migrations are associated with generally mobile pastoralist steppe communities moving into areas previously occupied by settled agricultural Neolithic or Bronze Age societies. The Indo-European languages likely spread into Central Asia during the 3rd millennium BC. And while we need to be careful cleanly associating language groups with archaeological cultures, which are defined by common trends in material culture, not necessarily language, specialists often connect the Indo-European movements with what's called the Andronovo horizon, a cultural horizon that spread through Central Asia during the 2nd millennium BC. And while again we need to be careful, it is generally believed that the dialects of Indo-European spoken within this Andronovo culture would diversify into the Indo-Aryan, Iranian, and the smaller Nuristani branches, the three branches all having their origin within the Central Asian Andronovo culture before spreading into different regions. Generally speaking, the speakers of Indo-Aryan languages spread south and east into South Asia, while the speakers of the Iranian languages remained in Central Asia while also spreading southwest into what is now Iran, and at least in one migration, migrating back into the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Now the Mitanni state, also known by various other names such as Hani-Galbat or Huri, was a polity located in Upper Mesopotamia and southern Anatolia. It was a significant power in the region between probably about the early 16th century BC and the mid-13th century BC, after which time it fell to Hittite and then later Middle Assyrian conquests. The Mitanni state ruled over a multi-ethnic population, but it generally had a Hurrian-speaking elite. The Hurrians were a group that probably originated further north, perhaps around Lake Van, before moving south into Upper Mesopotamia. So what is the connection between this Hurrian-dominated Mitanni state and the Indo-Aryan languages? It seems they really should have been far too distant from each other to have any meaningful connection. And yet historically, we find our earliest attestation of any Indo-Aryan language within a stratum found only in Mitanni. Although I should clarify that this is approximately as old as the Rig Veda. We just don't have the physical attestation for the Rig Veda until much later. So what does this stratum look like? Well, it takes three forms. First, preserved in Mitanni records, we have names that appear to be Indo-Aryan in origin. Primarily, these are the names of kings, implying an influence at a very high level. These names include Thushurata, from the Indo-Aryan Tvesharatha, meaning something like the one who possesses a charging chariot. Artatama, meaning something along the lines of he who dwells in righteousness. Biridashwa from the Indo-Aryan Pritashva, meaning he whose horse is dear. These elite Indo-Aryan derived names, though, are all clearly influenced by the local languages of the region, particularly the Hurrian language, the language which was generally spoken by the Mitanni elite. Indeed, the kings with these names almost certainly spoke Hurrian as their native language. This indicates an elite that was influenced by the Indo-Aryan language and culture, rather than simply an Indo-Aryan speaking elite existing at the top of the Mitanni state. Again, these were probably people who spoke Hurrian, but some of whom had Indo-Aryan names. Our second part of this stratum is that we have attested names of Indo-Aryan gods in Mitanni records, primarily recorded in treaties signed by Mitanni rulers. These gods include Uruvana, identified with the Vedic god Varuna; Indara, identified with the Vedic god Indra; Mitra, identified with the Vedic god Mitra; and Nishatyana, identified with the Vedic god Nisatya, although interestingly with a Hurrian grammatical ending. These gods are highly important and show a significant Indo-Aryan influence on Mitanni religion. But it also needs to be emphasised that we don't know what these gods meant to the Hurrian-speaking elite. Nor are Indo-Aryan gods in any way dominant within the Mitanni pantheon, the majority of gods worshipped being derived from Hurrian or other West Asian traditions. Finally, our last part of this stratum comes mainly from one text and deals with vocabulary primarily connected to the training of horses, including particularly the use of numbers as they relate to horse training. The relevant source here comes from the writings of Kekuli, a man who is described as a master horse trainer from the kingdom of Mitanni, who is employed by the Hittites as a horse trainer for their army. While most of the document is written in Hittite, some of the terms contained within appear to be fossilised Indo-Aryan connected vocabulary. While Kekuli himself probably didn't speak an Indo-Aryan language, he is still using fossilised Indo-Aryan terminology when he describes the training of horses. This may also be reflected in the Maryanu warrior class, a hereditary chariot warrior elite within Mitanni society. Maryanu itself having a plausible Indo-Aryan etymology, and the Maryanu fighting style appearing to be reminiscent of the Indo-Aryan fighting style, although this is not necessarily exclusive. There were other chariot fighting cultures in the region. And there are also a handful of other Indo-Aryan traces too, ones that are maybe less plausible or less attested by the relevant scholarship, but worth mentioning. Both the term Mitanni itself and the Mitanni capital, Washukani, for instance, have plausible Indo-Aryan etymologies, although they are significantly less secure than those found within our other sources. So what was this Indo-Aryan language in Mitanni? Well, when I first heard about this, my first question was probably the same as many of yours. How can we tell that this is an Indo-Aryan language influencing Mitanni, as opposed to something else within the broader Indo-Iranian family, or indeed an Iranian language itself? And this is something scholars have argued about. Writing back in the 1960s, Annelius Kamenhuber argued that these terms might not actually represent true Indo-Aryan terms, but instead a potentially undifferentiated Indo-Iranian language that wasn't neatly identifiable as either Iranian or Indo-Aryan. This theory helps explain the location of the language, as we know other Indo-Iranian languages were migrating into the region around this time. Primarily, of course, those that would become the Iranian languages proper. And of course, it is entirely possible that there were other connected but now lost languages within that same migration. However, while of course we have to be careful here, it really does seem that the language represented in the Mitanni stratum does contain traits specific to the Indo-Aryan languages, marking them specifically as Indo-Aryan rather than broadly Indo-Iranian. And today the scholarly consensus is that whatever language influenced the Mitanni was very much an Indo-Aryan language, even if a very early and undifferentiated form. In particular, the language preserves numerical terms that seem very much more in line with Indo-Aryan and not identifiable with the wider Indo-Iranian. While we have relatively little to go on here, we can tell a little bit about the circumstances through which Indo-Iranian arrived in West Asia and went on to influence the Mitanni. First, because most of the names with Indo-Aryan etymologies are royal names, and the royal names are the clearest and easiest to tie to secure Indo-Aryan etymologies, we know that whatever form this influence must have taken, it must have had a pretty significant effect on the elite parts of Mitanni society. Enough that many of the elite would go on to take on these Indo-Aryan influenced names. And second, we know that there was an element of Indo-Aryan religious influence in Mitanni. While most of the gods referenced in the relevant texts are Hurrian, not Indo-Aryan, and we should be careful to stress this, the religion worshipped in Mitanni was not some form of Proto-Hinduism or Vedic religion. The incorporation of Indo-Aryan gods into the Hurrian pantheon shows that when the Indo-Aryan influence occurred in Mitanni, the beliefs and practices of these Indo-Aryans were considered to be worth incorporating into Mitanni belief. Third, it also appears that based on the Kukuli text, that the Indo-Aryans who influenced the Mitanni may have been influential in the transmission of horse and chariot technology into the Mitanni, something the Mitanni would later be known for. It is likely that this suggests a significant degree of military influence, given the martial significance of these technologies. But how did the Indo-Aryans make it all the way to the Mitanni? Well, they probably didn't arrive directly from India. The Indo-Aryan languages likely split from the broader Indo-Iranian languages sometime during the Andhra Novo culture, likely prior to 1500 BC. And while we can't place exactly where the Indo-Aryan languages originate, it has often been theorized that they were significantly influenced in an early stage of their development by the Bactria-Margiana archaeological complex, which would place the origins of the Indo-Aryan languages in the southern Central Asian region, although this is relatively speculative. You might say this might be in modern Turkmenistan or modern Uzbekistan, or perhaps the north of Iran or Afghanistan, or somewhere in that broader region. While the most significant branch of the Indo-Aryan languages would eventually make their way south through modern Afghanistan into the Indian subcontinent, it seems fairly likely that these were not the only branches of Indo-Aryan, and it is possible that other Indo-Aryan groups could have split off in other directions, including going west and south into modern Iran, from where a group could have ended up in the Levant, influencing the Mitanni. Other routes, though, are of course also possible. We know that some speakers of Iranian languages migrated back into Central Asia and into Europe and the Caucasus. And it is possible that some speakers of Indo-Aryan languages also did this, and the Indo-Aryan influence in Mitanni could have come via a northern route through the Caucasus, although this does seem much less direct and is probably much less likely. By the Iron Age, Iranian languages were spread out across much of the Iranian plateau and the steppe, while Indo-Aryan languages were concentrated in South Asia. But in the Bronze Age, the distribution of Indo-Aryan, Iranian, and related Indo-Iranian varieties was probably less neatly divided than it would later become. There may have been overlapping zones, extinct branches, and mobile groups whose languages left little or no record. There may have been Eastern Iranian speakers around what is today Afghanistan, Western Iranian speakers around the Iranian plateau, and of course Indo-Aryan speakers in South Asia. But these areas aside, there are still quite a few places where Indo-Aryan speakers could have migrated prior to the linguistic levelling of the Achaemenid Persian Empire during the Iron Age. Indeed, it is fairly likely that during the Bronze Age, the geographic separation between the Indo-Aryan and the Iranian languages may have been much less clear than it is today, with various different overlapping regions and patchworks of different Iranian and Indo-Aryan languages, across a region stretching from the Zagros to the Tian Shan Mountains. It may also be that there were more language groupings involved here than just the Indo-Aryan and the Iranian languages. And while speakers of these languages represent 99% of speakers of the Indo-Iranian languages today, There is still a third branch of the Indo-Iranian family tree. Deep in the east of Afghanistan and the northwest of Pakistan, there are speakers of the Nuristani languages, a set of languages that so far seem to have resisted classification as either Indo-Aryan or Iranian, despite clearly being Indo-Iranian. During the Late Bronze Age, it is quite possible that there were even more branches of Indo-Iranian, scattered all the way throughout this region, that have now been lost. So if the Indo-Aryans that influenced the Mitanni could have come from somewhere significantly more proximate than India, that helps us explain their presence to a greater degree. But what form did this influence take? Well, we are not entirely sure, but there are some different possibilities. Given the clear Indo-Iranian royal influences, older scholarship often suggested a model involving an Indo-Aryan elite takeover. In this model, the Mitanni state would represent a Western Indo-Aryan military expansion, where a chariot-riding Indo-Aryan elite conquered the Mitanni kingdom in an early stage and brought the Indo-Aryan language, religion, and technology into the north of the Fertile Crescent. This Indo-Aryan elite would have become gradually Hurrianized over time, until, by the point that we have evidence from the kingdom, the Indo-Aryan influences appear to have been mostly fossilized and used within a Hurrian, Akkadian, or in the case of Kikuli, Hittite language framework. This would explain why the evidence seems most strongly concentrated in the most elite rungs of Mitanni society. However, it does run into a few problems. First, it seems that rather than there being an Indo-Aryan elite ruling over a Hurrian-speaking population, the elite themselves were very much Hurrian speakers and ruled over a much larger multicultural population. The Indo-Aryan terms that we do have are clearly influenced by the languages of Bronze Age West Asia. There is also remarkably little archaeological evidence for an Indo-Aryan presence in the region. While we might not have a clear idea of what a Western Indo-Iranian material culture might look like here, there really does seem to be precious little evidence of any significant material culture from east of the Zagros Mountains in the archaeological finds of the Mitanni kingdom. This doesn't entirely discount the idea of a chariot-riding Indo-Aryan elite ruling over the Mitanni, but it does complicate that interpretation. Our biggest problem, though, is that the Indo-Aryan footprint in Mitanni is pretty tiny. A handful of words, some concepts, a small minority of their gods, and some vocabulary related to their technologies. How they got there is highly interesting, but if this really was an Indo-Aryan kingdom, at least in an early form, we would probably see much more influence from Indo-Aryan language, religion, and culture than we do. That doesn't mean that a chariot elite takeover is impossible or entirely discredited, but we might want to search for alternative explanations. One alternative explanation is that somehow an Indo-Aryan splinter group became incorporated into the Mitanni elite. There are a variety of ways this could have occurred. One possibility is that what we are seeing is limited evidence from a small immigration of Indo-Aryan speaking groups into the Fertile Crescent during the early stages of the formation of the Mitanni kingdom. While they might have been too small to form a coherent community on their own and became assimilated into wider Hurrian society, they may still have left some impact, with their more important gods being picked up by wider Hurrian society, and some of their technology becoming incorporated into Hurrian warfare. This would explain the small quantity of linguistic evidence and the lack of archaeological evidence for an Indo-Aryan presence, but it also might struggle to explain why our evidence is concentrated in the social elite. Alternatively, the Indo-Aryan splinter group in question may have been a warrior elite. In this model, the warrior elite does not have to take over the kingdom entirely, but they may have been incorporated as mercenaries or otherwise integrated into the military. This would explain their relative prestige, their influence on military-adjacent technologies, and the relative lack of evidence for a significant Indo-Aryan presence, especially if the warrior elite was relatively small. It is also possible that this warrior elite may have formed the core of what would become the Marianu chariot caste within the Mitanni military. It could also explain the royal names, if this elite was meaningfully influential. However, as much as this does generally fit the available evidence, it is still pretty speculative, and should not be simply assumed to be correct, but instead treated as one of a number of interesting possibilities. This could also be the case of vassal or tributary influence. We don't know the exact boundaries of the Mitanni state, and in any case the boundaries would not have been as clear as those of a modern territorial state. The outer boundaries of the realm would have been comprised of entities with varying status, buffer kingdoms with a degree of Mitanni support, tributary states, vassal states with de facto near independence, and it is possible that at least some point, Mitanni or a previous Hurrian state may have had an Indo-Aryan entity as a vassal or accepted tribute from them. This could have led to a small but meaningful Indo-Aryan influence on the Mitanni kingdom through things like royal intermarriage. And this could match the available evidence. However, while we don't know how far Indo-Aryan peoples might have extended into Iran, this does seem to be assuming Mitanni influence significantly further east than we might traditionally accept. We could also be looking at a much lower level of contact than the incorporation of an Indo-Aryan splinter group. For instance, the influence that we do have might be explained by dynastic marriages from people from east of the Zagros. This might explain the presence of Indo-Aryan naming conventions within the royal elite and some transfer of technology, while also explaining the minimal presence of archaeological evidence. However, we might also need to be careful here, as it might be too tenuous of a connection. As limited as the evidence is, royal marriages might not be significant enough to explain dynastic names, technologies, and religious influence. As a final note here, there may be reason to believe Indo-Aryan influence in the ancient Near East extended further than just the Mitanni. While it is less attested than the Mitanni, there is evidence for Indo-Aryan influence on the Kassites during the same time period as the Mitanni kingdom. And indeed this influence appears to take a similar form, with technical vocabulary related to horses, possibly Indo-Aryan influenced royal names, and the presence of possibly Indo-Aryan gods within the Kassite pantheon, possibly providing evidence for another instance of Indo-Aryan influence on ancient Western Asia, albeit likely a quite limited one. But those are my thoughts. What do you think? Please give me your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and if I've gotten anything wrong or I've missed anything, please mention it below.